Most people think courage is something you are born with. They think brave people never feel fear, never shake in the dark, never cry when no one is watching. But that is not true. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what happens when a person has every reason to break and still refuses to fall apart. This is a story about a woman who had nothing left, no home, no family beside her, no weapon in her hand. She had only her voice, her rage, and a fire inside her chest that no amount of suffering could put out. And it is also a story about a man from a world she had been taught to hate, a warrior painted in dust and blood, who did something no one expected. Not her, not his own people, not even himself, perhaps. What happened between them on the open plains of Texas in the mid-1800s is not a love story in the way you might imagine. It is something rawer than that, something more honest. It is a story about two human beings who looked at each other across a wall of hatred and somehow found a crack in it. And what came through that crack changed both of them forever. If you think you know how this ends, you are wrong. Stay with this story. It will surprise you the way real life always does, in ways no one could ever make up. The year was 1846. Texas was a place that felt like the edge of the known world. The land stretched out flat and golden in every direction, broken only by clusters of oak trees and the slow, winding paths of rivers that seemed too tired to move. The sky above was enormous, pale blue in the mornings and burning orange in the evenings, and at night it filled with more stars than any person could count in a lifetime. It was beautiful. It was also deadly. For the settlers who had come from the eastern states and from Europe, Texas was a promise. They had heard about the land, about how much of it there was, about how a man could build something with his own hands and call it his. They came in wagons loaded with furniture and seeds and tools and children. They came with hope in their hearts and ignorance in their heads. Because what most of them did not understand, or refused to understand, was that this land already belonged to someone. The Comanche had lived on these plains for generations. They were not just residents of this land. They were part of it. They knew every river crossing, every buffalo trail, every place where the water ran sweet and where it ran bitter. They were horsemen like no others on the continent. A Comanche warrior on horseback was said to be the finest cavalry fighter in the world. They could shoot arrows at full gallop hanging off the side of their horses with only a heel hooked over the animal's back. They were not people to be pushed aside easily. And they had no intention of being pushed aside at all. The conflict between the settlers and the Comanche was not a simple story of good and evil. It was a collision, two ways of life smashing into each other with terrible force. Both sides committed acts of violence that would haunt the region for decades. The settlers burned Comanche camps. The Comanche raided settler homesteads. Children were taken, women were taken, men were killed in their fields, warriors were shot from their horses. It was a cycle of blood and grief that seemed to have no end and no beginning. Into this world, a woman named Margaret came with her husband and two small children. Margaret was 26 years old. She had brown hair that she kept pinned behind her head and hands that were rough from years of work. She was not a soft woman. She had grown up on a farm in Tennessee where the work never stopped, and complaining about it earned you nothing but a longer chore list. She could skin a deer, stitch a wound, plant a field, and deliver a calf. She had buried her mother when she was 14, and her father when she was 19. And she had learned early that the world did not care about your pain. You either kept moving, or you lay down and died. Her husband, Robert, was a good man, but a quiet one. He was the kind of man who showed love through labor rather than words. He had heard about the land grants in Texas and had convinced Margaret that they should go. A fresh start, he said, a place of their own. Margaret had not wanted to leave Tennessee. She had a feeling in her gut that she could not explain, a weight that sat on her chest every time she thought about heading west. But she trusted Robert. He had never led her wrong before. So she packed up their things, held her children close, and climbed into the wagon. The journey itself was hard but uneventful. They traveled with a group of 12 other families, all heading for the same stretch of land near the Brazos River. The group moved slowly, maybe 15 miles on a good day, less when the ground was muddy or a wheel broke or someone got sick. Margaret walked beside the wagon most of the time to save the oxen. Her daughter Sarah, who was 5, rode inside with the supplies. Her son James, who was 3, sometimes walked with her and sometimes rode on Robert's shoulders. They arrived at their plot of land in early spring. The grass was already tall and green, and wildflowers dotted the fields in patches of yellow and purple. Robert stood on the rise of a small hill and looked out over their new home and smiled in a way Margaret had not seen him smile in years. She wanted to smile too. She wanted to feel what he felt. But that weight on her chest was still there, heavier now, pressing against her ribs like a fist. They built their cabin in 3 weeks with help from the nearest neighbors, a family called the Parkers who lived about 4 miles to the east. The cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace and a loft where the children slept. But it was solid. Robert was a good builder. He made the walls thick and the door strong, and he cut slots in the wood near the windows, narrow openings that Margaret knew were not for ventilation. They were for rifle barrels. She asked him about it one evening after the children were asleep. "Are we safe here?" she said. Robert looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "We are as safe as anyone is anywhere." Margaret knew that was not an answer, but she also knew it was the only one he had. The first few months were good. They planted corn and beans and squash. Robert traded with the Parker family for a milk cow and a few chickens. Sarah made a friend in a girl from another nearby homestead, a child named Elizabeth, who had red hair and a gap in her front teeth and a laugh that could be heard across a field. James learned to walk without falling every 10 steps and developed a fascination with bugs that kept him occupied for hours. Margaret began to feel, slowly, carefully, like maybe this would work. Maybe Robert had been right. Maybe this was the fresh start they needed. But the land had its own plans. The first sign of trouble came in June. A rider came through the settlement one afternoon. Moving fast, his horse lathered with sweat. He stopped just long enough to shout that a homestead 30 miles to the north had been raided. A family of 5, all killed. The cabin burned to the ground. "Comanche," the rider said. Then he rode on to warn the next settlement. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Robert. He was already moving, checking the rifle, counting the ammunition, testing the bar on the door. That night they did not sleep. They sat in the dark cabin with the fire low, listening to every sound outside. The wind in the grass, an owl somewhere in the trees, the creak of the cabin settling into the earth. Every sound was a threat. Every silence was worse. The days that followed were tense but uneventful. No raid came to their settlement. After a week, people began to relax. After 2 weeks, some of the men started saying the rider had exaggerated, that maybe it was not Comanche at all, that maybe it was bandits or a house fire. People believe what they want to believe. It is easier than facing the truth. Margaret did not relax. She kept a knife in her apron pocket. From that day forward, she taught Sarah how to hide in the root cellar and told her that if anything bad ever happened, she was to take James down there and not come out until Margaret or Robert came for her. Sarah looked at her mother with wide, serious eyes and nodded. She did not ask why. Children on the frontier grew up fast. They learned to read danger before they learned to read words. The summer passed. The crops grew well. Robert took the wagon to a trading post, 2 days' ride to the south, and came back with salt, sugar, gunpowder, and a bolt of blue fabric that he gave to Margaret without a word. She held it against her chest and felt tears burn in her eyes because she understood what it meant. It meant he was thinking about something other than survival. It meant he believed they would be here long enough for her to make a dress. It was the most hopeful thing she had seen since they arrived. She made the dress in the evenings by firelight while the children slept. It was nothing fancy. Simple cut, long sleeves, a hem that fell just above her ankles. But the blue was beautiful, the color of the sky just before twilight. And when she put it on for the first time, Robert looked at her, and his eyes went soft in a way that made her chest ache with love and with fear. Because she knew that the more you loved something, the more you had to lose. Autumn came, and the air turned crisp, and the leaves on the oak trees went gold and red. They harvested the crops and stored what they could. Robert hunted deer, and Margaret smoked the meat over slow fires that filled the air with a rich, heavy scent. They were preparing for winter. They were preparing for a future. And for a little while, Margaret let herself believe in it. The morning of October 14 started like any other. Robert was in the field, checking the fence line. Margaret was inside, grinding corn. Sarah was outside playing near the tree line with a rag doll Margaret had sewn for her birthday. James was sitting on the cabin floor, stacking wooden blocks that Robert had carved for him. The sun was up and the sky was clear, and there was no warning. There is never any warning. Margaret heard it before she saw it. A sound like thunder but wrong, coming from the wrong direction, too fast, too sharp. She went to the window and looked out, and her entire world ended in that moment. There were riders coming across the field, maybe 20 of them, moving at full speed, painted horses and painted faces and weapons raised high. She could see Robert in the field. He had turned toward the sound. He was running, not toward the cabin, toward Sarah. Margaret screamed his name. She screamed Sarah's name. She grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace and ran to the door. But she stopped. James was on the floor behind her, looking up at her with his father's eyes, not understanding, not afraid yet because he did not know that he should be. She had 2 children. One was outside, one was inside. And in that moment she had to make a choice that no mother should ever have to make. She grabbed James and ran for the root cellar. She pulled open the hatch and put him inside, and she said the words she had practiced with Sarah. "Stay here. Do not come out. Do not make a sound." James started to cry, and Margaret put her hand over his mouth, gently but firmly, and she looked into his eyes and she said, "I will come back for you. I promise." Then she closed the hatch and ran outside. What she saw when she came through the door would live behind her eyes for the rest of her life. Robert was on the ground in the field. He was not moving. There was an arrow in his chest and another in his side, and the ground around him was dark with blood. Sarah was screaming, running toward the cabin, her little legs pumping, her rag doll forgotten in the grass behind her, and between Sarah and the cabin there were horses. Margaret raised the rifle and fired. The shot hit one of the riders in the shoulder, and he jerked sideways on his horse but did not fall. She did not have time to reload. She ran toward Sarah with the empty rifle in her hands, swinging it like a club, screaming words that were not words, just sound, just rage and terror pouring out of her throat. A horse cut in front of her, and something hit her across the back of the head, and the world tilted sideways and went grey. She did not lose consciousness entirely. She wished she had. Through the ringing in her ears and the blur in her vision, she saw them take Sarah. She saw her daughter lifted onto a horse by a warrior who held her easily with one arm while the child kicked and screamed and reached for her mother. Margaret tried to stand. Her legs would not work. She crawled. She crawled across the dirt toward her daughter, reaching out with one hand, fingers stretching, and she could see Sarah's face, twisted with fear, tears cutting lines through the dust on her cheeks, and she could hear her daughter screaming one word over and over. "Mama, mama, mama." Then a rope went around Margaret's wrists and she was dragged. The ground tore at her dress, her skin, her knees. She could see the sky above her, that enormous Texas sky, impossibly blue and impossibly indifferent. And she thought, this cannot be real. This cannot be happening. But it was. When they finally stopped, Margaret was thrown onto the ground like a sack of grain. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the rope. Her blue dress was torn and stained with dirt and blood. She could taste copper in her mouth. She rolled onto her side and looked around, trying to find Sarah, trying to find her daughter in the chaos of horses and men and dust. She found her. Sarah was sitting on the ground about 20 feet away, held by a woman with long dark hair. The woman was not hurting her. She was holding the child on her lap, keeping her still. Sarah had stopped screaming. She was just crying now, that silent, shaking kind of crying that is worse than any scream, because it means the fear has gone so deep that sound cannot reach it. Margaret tried to move toward her daughter, and a foot pressed down on her back, pinning her to the ground. She heard voices above her, speaking in a language she did not understand, men talking, deciding. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her the way a person assesses livestock. She was merchandise now. She was a prize of war. They tied her more securely. Ropes around her wrists and ankles, tight enough to cut off circulation, tight enough to make her fingers swell and go numb. They put her on a horse, belly down across its back, and they rode. She could see the ground passing below her, the grass and rocks and dirt, and every stride of the horse sent pain through her ribs. She did not know where they were taking her. She did not know if James was still alive in the root cellar. She did not know if Robert was dead or dying alone in that field. She knew only that Sarah was somewhere in this group of riders, and that as long as that was true, she would not give up. She would not break. She would not die. The ride lasted for hours. The sun moved across the sky, and shadows grew long, and the air turned cold. Margaret's body was a landscape of pain. Her head throbbed where she had been struck. Her wrists burned under the ropes. Her ribs ached from the horse's spine pressing into them with every step. But she kept her eyes open. She watched the land. She noted the direction of the sun. She counted rivers crossed and hills climbed. She was making a map in her mind because she had decided something. She was going to survive this, and she was going to take her daughter home. When they finally made camp as the sun was setting, Margaret was pulled off the horse and dropped on the ground. She lay there for a moment, letting the stillness wash over her, letting her body register all the places it was broken. Then she pushed herself up onto her knees and she looked around the camp with clear eyes. And what she saw told her that she was in more danger than she had imagined. This was not a small raiding party. This was a large Comanche camp, maybe 100 people or more, with teepees already set up and fires burning and horses tied in long lines along a creek. They had ridden into a world she did not know, a world with its own rules and its own justice, and she was entirely at its mercy. A warrior approached her. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from dark wood. His hair was long and black and braided with leather and beads. He had scars on his arms and chest. He was not young, maybe 35, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had fought many times and won. He stopped in front of her and looked down at her, and he said something she did not understand. Margaret looked up at him. Her face was swollen. Her dress was ruined. There was blood in her hair and dirt in her wounds, and every part of her body was screaming for relief. But her eyes were clear and her jaw was set, and when she spoke, her voice did not shake. "Touch me," she said, "and I will kill you." The warrior tilted his head slightly. He did not understand her words, but he understood her tone. He understood the fire in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of animals that had been cornered, in the eyes of warriors facing death. It was the look of something that would rather die fighting than live surrendering. He looked at her for a long moment. The camp was noisy around them, voices and horses and the crack of fires. But in the space between this man and this woman, there was silence. A silence heavy with something neither of them could name. Then the Comanche warrior knelt down beside her. He pulled a knife from his belt. Margaret did not flinch. She stared at him with those burning eyes and waited for whatever was coming. She had made her peace. If this was the end, she would meet it with her eyes open. But the warrior did not raise the knife against her. He reached down and he cut the ropes around her ankles. Then he cut the ropes around her wrists. The blood rushed back into her hands and the pain was incredible, like fire flowing through her veins. And she gasped, but she did not cry out. She would not give him that. The warrior stood up and looked down at her. His expression had not changed. It was still unreadable, carved from stone and shadow. But he had done something that made no sense. He had freed her hands and feet while she was a captive in the middle of an enemy camp. And as Margaret sat there on the cold ground, rubbing the feeling back into her wrists, she understood that whatever was happening, it was not what she had expected. This was not the story she had been told about these people. This was something else entirely. She did not know it yet, but this moment would change the course of her life. This man, this warrior whose name she did not know, and whose language she could not speak, had just opened a door that neither of them could close. And what lay on the other side of it was something neither of them was prepared for. The night fell around the camp like a curtain. The stars came out, thick and bright, the same stars Margaret had watched from her cabin porch while Robert sat beside her and the children slept inside. The same sky, a different world. She pulled her torn dress tighter around her shoulders and she watched the warrior walk away into the firelight. And she made herself a promise. She was not done. She was not broken. She was just beginning. Margaret did not sleep that first night. She sat on the cold ground with her back against a fallen log, and she kept her eyes open and moving, scanning the camp like an animal watching for predators. The fire nearest to her threw orange light across the ground and cast long shadows from the teepees that stretched out like dark fingers pointing toward the horizon. She could hear the sounds of the camp settling, low voices, the stamp and snort of horses. Somewhere a baby was crying, a thin, wavering sound that cut through the night air and made Margaret's chest ache because it sounded like James. Her James. Her little boy who was alone in a dark root cellar, if he was even still alive. If someone had found him. If he had not crawled out and wandered into the empty, burned world above. She pushed that thought away. She could not afford it. Grief was a luxury for people who were safe, and she was not safe. She was a captive in a Comanche camp, with no weapon, no horse, no knowledge of the land, and no ally. What she had was her daughter, somewhere in this camp, and the memory of a warrior who had cut her ropes for reasons she could not understand. She would work with what she had. She had always worked with what she had. When the sun came up, the camp came alive in ways that surprised her. She had expected chaos, brutality, savagery. That was what she had been told about these people. Every story she had ever heard about the Comanche painted them as monsters, as creatures without mercy or feeling, as something less than human. But what she saw in the early morning light was something different. She saw women building fires and preparing food, talking to each other in low voices, laughing sometimes. She saw children chasing each other between the teepees, playing games that looked no different from the games Sarah played with Elizabeth back at the settlement. She saw men tending to horses with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she thought she knew about warriors. It confused her. And Margaret did not like being confused. She liked to understand things, to sort them into categories, to know what was dangerous and what was safe. But this place refused to sort itself neatly. It was dangerous and domestic at the same time, violent and tender, foreign and strangely familiar. An older woman came to her in the early morning, carrying a bowl of something that steamed in the cool air. The woman had deep lines on her face and silver in her hair and eyes that were sharp and assessing. She set the bowl down in front of Margaret and said something in Comanche and gestured toward it. Margaret looked at the food. It appeared to be some kind of stew, dark and thick with pieces of meat. Her stomach turned over with hunger. She had not eaten since the morning before the raid, and her body was screaming for fuel. But her pride told her not to take anything from these people. Her pride told her that eating their food was a kind of surrender. Her body won the argument. She picked up the bowl and ate. The stew was rich and gamey, probably buffalo, seasoned with something she could not identify. It was good. She hated that it was good. The old woman watched her eat with a look that might have been satisfaction and might have been pity. When Margaret finished, the woman took the bowl and walked away without another word. Margaret spent the rest of the morning looking for Sarah. She stood up on shaking legs and walked through the camp, ignoring the stares, ignoring the murmurs, searching every group of children, every teepee entrance, every cluster of women. People watched her, but no one stopped her. This surprised her too. She was a captive, but she was walking freely through the camp. She did not understand the rules here. She did not know what was allowed and what would get her killed. She found Sarah near the edge of the camp, sitting with the same dark-haired woman who had held her during the ride. Sarah was eating something from a wooden bowl, and her face was still red and swollen from crying, but she was calm. When she saw Margaret, her eyes went wide and she dropped the bowl and ran to her mother with a cry that shattered the morning quiet. Margaret fell to her knees and caught her daughter and held her so tightly that she could feel the child's heartbeat against her own chest. Sarah was shaking. She buried her face in Margaret's torn dress and said things that were half words and half sobs. Mama, scared. Papa, home. Want to go home. Margaret held her daughter's head against her shoulder, and she said things that were lies. Things like it will be all right and we're going to be fine and I am here now. She said them because that is what mothers do. They lie to keep their children from breaking. The dark-haired woman watched this reunion without interfering. She sat quietly with her hands in her lap and her face still. Margaret looked at her over Sarah's head, and something passed between them. Not friendship, not trust, but a recognition. Maybe. One woman looking at another woman and seeing someone who understood what it meant to care for a child. It was the smallest bridge imaginable, just a sliver of shared humanity across a canyon of difference. But it was there. Margaret learned later that the woman's name was Nahoa. She was the wife of one of the camp's senior warriors, and she had been given responsibility for Sarah. In the Comanche way, captive children were often adopted into the tribe, raised as Comanche, given new names and new lives. This was not cruelty in their eyes. It was incorporation. It was making the group stronger by adding new members. Margaret did not see it that way. She saw only that someone was trying to take her child, and every fiber of her being rejected it. But she was smart enough not to fight it openly. Not yet. She watched. She listened. She began to learn. The warrior who had cut her ropes was named Takapai. She did not learn this immediately. She learned it in pieces, the way she learned everything in those first days, through observation and gesture and the slow, painful accumulation of understanding. Takapai was a war chief, though not the principal chief of the band. He had authority and respect. When he spoke at the evening councils, other men listened. When he rode out to hunt, other warriors followed him. He was not the loudest voice in the camp. He was the one that mattered when things were serious. Margaret watched him the way she watched everything, carefully and from a distance. She tried to understand why he had cut her ropes. Was it a sign of respect? Was it a test? Was it some kind of Comanche custom she did not know about? She turned it over in her mind endlessly, examining it from every angle, and she could not find an explanation that satisfied her. What she did notice was that Takapai kept a kind of watch over her. He did not approach her directly after that first night. He did not speak to her, but she would see him standing at the edge of her vision, leaning against a horse or sitting by a fire, and his eyes would be on her. Not threatening, not leering, just watching, as if he was trying to figure something out about her the same way she was trying to figure something out about him. Margaret was put to work. This was expected. Everyone in a Comanche camp worked as the women had their tasks and the men had theirs, and the division was clear and absolute. Margaret was given to the older woman who had brought her food that first morning. Her name was Pata, and she was Takapai's mother. This was not a coincidence, and Margaret knew it. She was being placed in his family's care. What that meant, she was not yet sure. Peter put Margaret to work immediately, scraping hides, hauling water from the creek, grinding dried meat into pemmican. The work was hard, but not harder than farm work, and Margaret threw herself into it with a grim determination that left her exhausted by nightfall. She did not complain. She did not resist. She worked because work kept her body occupied, and that meant her mind could focus on what mattered, finding a way out. She began to learn the language, not by choice at first, but by necessity. She needed to understand what was being said around her. She needed to know when danger was coming, when decisions were being made about her fate, when Sarah's name was mentioned. She started with simple words: water, fire, food, horse, yes, no. The sounds were strange to her mouth, guttural and flowing at the same time, and she mangled them badly at first. Peter corrected her with a patience that Margaret did not expect. The old woman would say a word slowly, watching Margaret's mouth, then nod or shake her head until the pronunciation was close enough. Sarah was learning faster. Children always learn faster. Within a week, Sarah was using Comanche words mixed with English, switching between them without thinking, the way children slip between worlds with an ease that adults can only envy. She was still frightened. She still cried at night and called for her father and begged to go home. But during the day, the resilience of childhood carried her forward. She played with the other children. She ate the food. She began to accept, in the way that children accept things, that this was where she was now. Margaret was not ready to accept anything. She was planning. Every day she noted the position of the sun. She watched which direction the hunters rode out and which direction they came from. She counted the horses and identified which ones were the fastest and which ones were kept closest to the camp. She noted the routines of the guards, when they changed position, when they slept, when they were distracted. She was building an escape plan in her mind, piece by piece the way Robert used to build furniture, measuring twice and cutting once, because she knew she would only get one chance. But the plan had a problem she could not solve. Sarah was kept close to Nahua. Margaret was kept close to Peter. They were on different sides of the camp. To escape, Margaret would need to get to Sarah, get 2 horses, and ride out in the middle of the night without being detected by an entire camp of people who had spent their lives reading the movements of animals across open ground. It was almost impossible, but almost was enough to keep her going. 2 weeks into her captivity, something happened that shifted the ground beneath her. A hunting party returned with a buffalo kill, and the camp erupted in celebration. There was feasting and drumming and dancing that went on long into the night. Margaret sat at the edge of the firelight watching, and she noticed that Takapai was not joining the celebration. He was standing apart near the horses, looking out at the dark plains. She did not know why she stood up. She did not know why she walked toward him. Later, she would tell herself it was strategic, that she was trying to get information, trying to find a weakness she could exploit. But that was not the whole truth. She stopped a few feet from him. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence without surprise. They stood there in silence for a while, two people looking out at the same darkness. The drums and singing from the camp filled the air behind them. The horses shifted and breathed nearby. Then Takapai spoke. He said something in Comanche, slowly, the way people speak to children or to those who are learning. Margaret caught one word. She thought it meant sky or stars or something related to what was above them. She looked up. The stars were staggering, a river of light pouring across the darkness. For just a moment, the beauty of it cut through everything else, through the fear and the anger and the grief, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt stillness. Takapai said another word and pointed to a cluster of stars near the horizon. Margaret did not know what he was saying, but she understood the gesture. It was showing her something, sharing something. It was such a simple human act that it disarmed her more than any weapon could have. She stood there beside the man who had helped capture her, and she looked at the stars he was pointing at, and she felt the wall inside her chest develop the smallest of cracks. She hated it. She hated that crack. She plastered over it with anger and turned and walked back to the camp without a word. But the crack was there now, and cracks, once formed, have a way of spreading. The weeks turned into a month. Margaret's body adapted to the work and the food and the rhythm of camp life, even as her mind continued to resist it. She grew stronger physically. The scraping and hauling built muscle in her arms and back that she had not had before. Her hands, already rough from farm life, became harder still, calloused and capable. She could build a fire as quickly as any woman in the camp. She could prepare hides with skill that earned a nod from Peter, which was the old woman's highest form of praise. Her language skills improved. She could follow simple conversations now and could make herself understood in basic terms. She learned that the band she was with was part of a larger Comanche group called the Penateka, the Honey Eaters, who ranged across the southern plains. She learned that they had been at war with the Texans for years and that many of them had lost family to settler violence. She learned that the raid on her homestead was a retaliation for a massacre of a Comanche peace delegation that had occurred several years earlier, a betrayal that had left a wound in the Comanche collective memory that was still bleeding. This information did not make her forgive what had happened to her. Robert was dead. Her home was ashes. Her son was lost. Her daughter was being reshaped into someone else. Forgiveness was not something she was capable of, but understanding was a different thing. Understanding did not require forgiveness. It only required the willingness to see the full picture instead of just your own corner of it. And Margaret, despite her rage, despite her grief, was a woman who wanted to understand things. She began to see the Comanche not as a monolith of savagery, but as individuals. There was Nahawa, who sang to Sarah at night, in a voice that was low and sweet, and who braided the child's hair with the same care Margaret had used. There was an old man called Mupitsukupu, who spent his days making arrows with a precision that was almost artistic, and who sometimes gave Margaret a toothless grin when she walked past. There were young warriors who were loud and boastful and reminded her of the boys she had known in Tennessee, full of energy and bravado and not enough sense. There were women who gossiped and argued and supported each other through births and deaths and daily hardships in ways that were no different from the women she had known her whole life. And there was Takapai. Always on the edge of her awareness, there was Takapai. He began to find reasons to be near her. Small reasons. He would bring a horse to be tended near where she was working. He would speak to his mother about something, and his eyes would drift to Margaret while he talked. He brought her a blanket one evening when the temperature dropped, handing it to Peter to give to her rather than approaching directly. It was courtship, Margaret realized. Oh, the Comanche version of it. He was showing interest in a way that was governed by rules she did not fully understand but could feel the shape of. She did not know what to do with this. Her husband had been dead for a month, and she was a captive, and this man was part of the world that had destroyed hers. Every rational thought in her head told her to reject this, to keep her wall solid, to stay focused on escape, and she did stay focused. She continued her observations, continued her planning, continued her calculations about horses and routes and timing. But she also found herself looking for Takapai in the camp the way she looked for Sarah. She found herself noticing when he was absent and feeling something that was not quite relief and not quite worry when he returned. She found herself listening more carefully when he spoke, not just for information but for the sound of his voice, which was deep and steady and carried a kind of calm authority that reminded her painfully of Robert. Not the same. Nothing like the same. But that quality of steadiness, of being a fixed point in a turning world. It was there in both men, and it called to something in her that she could not silence, no matter how hard she tried. One evening, about 6 weeks into her captivity, Margaret was sitting outside the teepee scraping a hide when Takapai came and sat down across from her. This was the first time he had been this close to her since the night he cut her ropes. Margaret's hands went still on the hide. She looked at him and waited. He spoke slowly, using simple words, mixing Comanche with hand gestures in a way that told her he was trying to make her understand. It took her a long time and several repetitions, but she finally grasped what he was saying. He was telling her about his wife. He had been married. His wife had died 2 winters ago, along with their infant son, during an epidemic of some kind. Sickness. Margaret knew the word. She had heard it in camp. It was spoken with a particular kind of weight, the way people speak about things they fear more than any enemy. Takapai was telling her about his dead wife. He was sharing his grief with her, and Margaret, sitting there with her rough hands and her torn blue dress, and her own grief like a stone inside her chest, understood this for what it was. It was not a ploy. It was not a strategy. It was one broken person reaching toward another broken person and saying, "I know what this feels like." She did something she had not planned to do. She put down the hide scraper, and she looked into his eyes and she said, in her clumsy, halting Comanche, "My husband is dead too." The words were simple and imperfect and probably grammatically wrong, but they were enough. Takapai's expression shifted. Not a lot. He was not a man whose face moved easily, but something behind his eyes changed. Some door opened, and for a moment they were not captor and captive. They were just two people who had lost something they could not get back. The moment passed. They went back to their separate worlds, but something had changed and they both knew it. Margaret lay awake that night and stared at the skin walls of the teepee and listened to Peter's steady breathing, and she tried to sort out what was happening inside her. She was grieving. She was angry. She was planning escape, and she was developing feelings for the man who had taken her from her home. These things should not have been able to exist in the same person at the same time, but they did. Human hearts are not logical. They do not follow rules. They contain contradictions that would destroy any machine, but somehow make a person stronger. She made a decision that night. She would not act on these feelings. She would not let them change her plan. She would still escape. She would still take Sarah. She would still find her way home and find James. But she would also stop lying to herself about what she felt. Because lying to yourself takes energy, and she needed every bit of energy she had. The opportunity she had been waiting for came 3 days later. A large hunting party was being organized to follow a buffalo herd that had been spotted 2 days' ride to the north. Most of the warriors would be going, including many of the men who served as camp guards. The camp would be lighter on security for several days. It was the best chance Margaret was going to get. She spent those 3 days preparing. She hid dried meat and a water skin in a spot near the horse line. She identified the 2 horses she would take, a fast mare and a steady gelding that Sarah could ride. She mapped the route in her mind, south and east toward the settlements, following the river she had memorized during the ride-in. She estimated 3 days of hard riding if everything went well. She knew everything would not go well, but she had a plan, and that was more than she had started with. The hunting party left on a cold morning. Margaret watched them go. Takapai was among them. He rode past her on his way out of camp, and their eyes met for a moment, and Margaret felt something tear inside her chest. She looked away first. She could not afford to look at him too long. She could not afford to feel what she was feeling. Not now. Not when she was about to run. That night, she would make her move. She would get Sarah. She would get the horses, and she would ride south into the darkness with nothing but the stars to guide her, and a knife she had stolen from Peter's cooking supplies tucked into her belt. She did not know if she would succeed. She did not know if she would survive, but she knew that she had to try, because the longer she stayed, the more she risked losing something she could not afford to lose, not her life. She had made peace with that possibility weeks ago. What she could not afford to lose was herself, the woman she had been before the raid, the mother, the wife, the person who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. That woman was being slowly replaced by someone new, someone who sat under Comanche stars and felt things for a Comanche warrior, and Margaret was not ready to become that person. She did not know if she would ever be ready. So she would run. She would run toward the life she knew, even if it was broken, even if there was nothing left of it but ashes and a root cellar, and the hope that her son was still alive. She would run because that was what survivors did. They ran toward the things that mattered, even when running was the hardest thing in the world. The moon rose late that night, thin and pale, offering just enough light to see by. Margaret waited until the camp was deep in sleep. Then she moved. Margaret moved through the sleeping camp like a shadow. Every step was measured, every breath controlled, every nerve in her body pulled tight as a bowstring. The thin moon cast silver light across the ground, and the teepees stood like pale ghosts against the dark sky. She could hear the camp breathing, the collective sound of 100 people lost in sleep, and she moved through that sound the way a fish moves through water, becoming part of it rather than disturbing it. She had spent weeks memorizing the layout of this camp. She knew where every teepee stood. She knew where the guard positions were, and she knew that tonight, with the hunting party gone, those positions were held by older men and younger boys who were less alert than the warriors who normally watched through the night. She knew where the dogs slept, and she had spent the last 3 days feeding scraps to the ones nearest her route so they would associate her smell with food rather than threat. It was a small thing, but survival was built on small things stacked one on top of another until they made something you could stand on. She reached Nahua's teepee and paused outside, listening. She could hear breathing from inside. 2 breaths, one deep and slow. An adult, one lighter, faster, a child. Sarah. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was afraid the sound would wake someone. She pressed her hand flat against her chest as if she could hold the sound in, and she closed her eyes for a moment and steadied herself. Then she lifted the edge of the teepee flap and slipped inside. The interior was dark and warm and smelled of smoke and dried herbs. Margaret's eyes adjusted quickly. She could see Nahua lying on one side of the teepee, wrapped in a buffalo robe, and there, on the other side, curled into a ball with a small blanket pulled up to her chin, was Sarah, Margaret's daughter, her reason for everything. Margaret knelt beside Sarah and put her hand over the child's mouth before she gently shook her shoulder. Sarah's eyes flew open, wide and white in the darkness, and Margaret felt the small body tense with fear beneath her hand. She leaned close to her daughter's ear and whispered the words she had practiced in her mind 1,000 times. "It is Mama. Do not make a sound. We are going home." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She nodded against Margaret's hand. Margaret slowly removed her fingers from the child's mouth, and Sarah sat up without a sound. She was trembling. Margaret took her daughter's hand and squeezed it once, hard. A squeeze that said, "I am here, and I will not let go." Then she turned toward the teepee entrance. Nahawa's breathing had not changed. It was still deep and steady and rhythmic. Margaret led Sarah to the flap, and they slipped out into the night air. The cold hit them immediately, sharp and clean, and Sarah shivered in her thin clothing. Margaret wrapped an arm around her daughter and pulled her close, and they began to move through the camp toward the horse line. They made it 50 yards before the first problem. A dog appeared from behind a teepee, a rangy brown animal with a torn ear and suspicious eyes. It looked at Margaret and Sarah, and its lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth. Margaret's left hand tightened on the knife in her belt. Her right hand held Sarah behind her. She stared at the dog, and the dog stared at her, and for a moment the entire escape balanced on the edge of an animal's decision. Margaret had one piece of dried meat left in her pocket. She had been saving it for exactly this kind of moment. She pulled it out slowly and tossed it toward the dog. The animal's attention shifted. It sniffed the meat, looked at Margaret once more, then picked up the food and trotted away into the shadows. Margaret exhaled a breath she did not know she had been holding and moved on. The horses were tied along the creek at the far edge of camp. Margaret found the 2 she had chosen, the fast mare and the steady gelding. She worked the rawhide knots with fingers that were shaking despite her best efforts to keep them still. The mare stamped her foot and tossed her head, and Margaret pressed her face against the animal's neck and made a low sound, a sound she had heard the Comanche women make when calming horses, a sound that was somewhere between a hum and a whisper. The mare settled. Margaret finished the knots and led both horses away from the line, moving slowly, keeping to the soft ground near the creek, where hooves would not ring on stone. She helped Sarah onto the gelding. The child was small, and the horse was tall, and it took effort to get her up. Margaret showed her how to hold the mane and grip with her knees. and she whispered that she must not let go no matter what happened. Sarah nodded with that serious expression that looked so much like Robert's face that Margaret had to look away for a moment to keep her composure. She mounted the mare. The horse shifted beneath her, sensing the tension in her rider's body. Margaret gathered the reins and the lead rope for the gelding, and she pointed them south, toward the river, toward the route she had mapped in her mind over weeks of careful observation. She took one last look at the camp behind her. The teepees were dark, the fires were low. The sky above was vast and scattered with stars. And then she kicked the mare forward, and they ran. They rode hard through the darkness, keeping to the low ground where the terrain was flatter and the horses could move faster. Margaret rode in front with the gelding's lead rope in her left hand, and her eyes fixed on the land ahead, reading the shadows for obstacles, for drop-offs, for anything that could bring a horse down at speed. Sarah clung to the gelding behind her, silent and brave, and Margaret felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost lifted her out of the saddle. They reached the river by the time the sky began to lighten in the east. Margaret did not stop. She pushed the horses into the water and they crossed, the cold current rising to her knees, the horses snorting and blowing as they fought the current. On the other side, Margaret turned east and kept riding. She needed to put as much distance as possible between them and the camp before anyone discovered they were gone. The sun came up and painted the plains in shades of gold and amber. Margaret looked behind her and saw nothing. No riders, no dust cloud, nothing but empty land stretching back to the horizon. She allowed herself a moment of something that was not quite hope, but was closer to it than anything she had felt in weeks. Maybe they would make it. Maybe the hunting party's absence had bought them enough time. Maybe the camp would not notice 2 missing horses and 2 missing captives until it was too late. She was wrong. They heard the riders before they saw them. That sound again, the sound of hooves at speed, the sound that had ended Margaret's old life and now threatened to end her escape. She looked back and her stomach dropped. There were riders on the horizon, maybe a mile behind them, moving fast. Not the hunting party. Those men were north, chasing buffalo. These were camp guards, the ones she had hoped would be too slow and too few to catch her. She counted 5 riders, 5 warriors on fresh horses against 2 exhausted animals carrying a woman and a child. The mathematics were brutal. She could not outrun them. She knew this with the certainty of someone who had grown up around horses and understood what tired animals could and could not do. She had maybe an hour before they caught her, maybe less. Margaret looked at the land ahead. The river curved to the south about half a mile away, cutting through a stand of cottonwood trees that grew thick along its banks. If she could reach those trees, she would have cover. Not much, but more than the open plain offered. She leaned forward on the mare and pushed the animal harder, asking for everything it had left, and the horse responded with a burst of speed that was born of courage or desperation or some combination of both. They reached the trees, and Margaret pulled the horses to a stop and jumped down. She lifted Sarah off the gelding and pushed her toward the thickest part of the underbrush. "Hide," she said, the same word she had taught her back at the cabin, a lifetime ago. Sarah looked at her with eyes that were huge and terrified and full of trust, and then she turned and crawled into the brush and disappeared. Margaret tied the horses to a low branch and pulled the knife from her belt. It was a cooking knife, maybe 8 inches long. Nothing compared to the weapons the riders were carrying. She positioned herself behind a thick cottonwood trunk and waited. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were steady. She had made her choice. She would fight. She would probably die, but she would not be taken again. Not alive. Not without blood. The riders arrived minutes later. They pulled up at the edge of the trees, and Margaret could hear them talking. Quick exchanges in Comanche, tactical and efficient. They knew she was in here. They were deciding how to approach. She pressed her back against the tree and gripped the knife and waited. Then she heard a voice she recognized. It cut through the others with an authority that silenced them immediately. Takapai. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be with the hunting party 2 days' ride to the north. But he was here. His voice was here, coming from just beyond the tree line, and Margaret felt something collapse inside her chest. A structure she had built out of anger and determination that suddenly had a crack in its foundation that it could not survive. Takapai called out. It was speaking to her. She could understand some of it. Her name, the Comanche version of it that the camp had given her, which sounded like Ma-ga-ret, with the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And other words. Come out. No harm. He was telling her to come out, and that she would not be harmed. Margaret did not move. She did not trust promises. She especially did not trust promises made by the people who held her captive. She stood behind the tree with her knife raised and her jaw set, and she said nothing. Takapai spoke again. This time his voice was different. The authority was still there, but it was layered with something else, something that sounded like the way he had spoken on the night he showed her the stars. He was not commanding her now. He was asking. Then she heard his footsteps. He was entering the trees alone. She could hear the other riders staying back, their horses stamping and blowing at the edge of the grove. Takapai was coming in by himself. Unarmed, she realized, as he appeared around the trunk of a cottonwood about 10 feet from her position. She could see his hands. They were empty, no weapon, no rope. Just open hands held slightly away from his body in a gesture that was universal across every culture and every language. I am not a threat. I come in peace. Margaret kept the knife up. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across the space between the trees. He was breathing hard from the ride. There was dust on his face and in his hair. His eyes were intense and locked onto hers, and in them she saw something she had been running from for weeks. She saw herself reflected back, not a captive, not an enemy, just a woman. Someone he saw clearly and saw completely and did not want to lose. He spoke again, slowly, using the simple words he always used with her. She caught pieces. The word for stay. The word for safe. A word she had not heard before that she would later learn meant something close to belong, or perhaps home. He was asking her to come back. He was telling her she was safe. He was telling her something about belonging. Margaret's arm was shaking now, not from fear, from the effort of holding up the knife and holding up the wall at the same time, because the wall was coming down. She could feel it. Piece by piece, stone by stone. It was crumbling under the weight of what she felt and what she saw in this man's eyes, and what she knew, in the deepest part of her heart, was true. He was not her enemy. He had never been her enemy. He had been, from the first moment he cut her ropes, something else entirely. She lowered the knife. It was the hardest thing she had ever done and the easiest. She lowered it to her side and she looked at Takapai and she said, in Comanche that was still rough but improving, my daughter stays with me. These were her terms, the only terms that mattered. Wherever she was, whatever happened, Sarah stayed with her. Takapai nodded. One nod, firm and final. It was an agreement, a promise made between two people who had learned to see each other across a divide that should have been uncrossable. Margaret called Sarah out of the brush. The child emerged with leaves in her hair and dirt on her face, and she ran to her mother and held on. Takapai watched this, and his expression softened in a way Margaret had never seen before. He turned and walked back toward the other riders and spoke to them in quick, decisive tones. Whatever he said ended the conversation. The riders relaxed. Weapons were lowered. The crisis was over. They rode back to the camp together, not as captors and captive, not as enemies, as something new that did not have a name yet in either of their languages. Margaret rode beside Takapai, and Sarah sat in front of her mother on the mare, and the sun climbed high into the sky, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful. When they returned to camp, things were different. Margaret was no longer treated as a captive. Takapai had made his intentions known to the camp leaders and to his mother, and while not everyone approved, his authority was sufficient to change Margaret's status. She was moved into Takapai's section of the camp. Sarah was returned to her permanently. Nahua accepted this with a grace that Margaret would remember and be grateful for long after. The transition was not smooth. There were people in the camp who resented Margaret's presence and her elevation from prisoner to something approaching a member of the band. There were women who had hoped Takapai would choose one of them and who viewed Margaret as an interloper from an enemy people. There were warriors who thought Takapai was being foolish, weakened by sentiment, distracted from his duties. The whispers followed Margaret through the camp like shadows, but Takapai stood firm. And Margaret, who had survived the destruction of one world and the terrifying immersion in another, found reserves of strength she did not know she had. She worked harder than anyone. She learned faster. She became skilled at hide preparation and food preservation and the countless tasks that kept the band alive. She earned respect not through Takapai's protection, but through her own labor and her own refusal to be anything less than capable. Sarah adapted with the resilience that only children possess. She became bilingual, switching between English and Comanche with a fluency that amazed Margaret. She made friends among the camp children. She learned to ride. She laughed again, which was the sound Margaret had been most afraid she would never hear. And between Margaret and Takapai, something grew. It grew slowly, the way things grow in harsh soil, with deep roots and tough stems. They learned each other's languages, meeting in the middle with a mixture of Comanche and English, and gesture that became their own private dialect. He told her about his childhood, about learning to ride and hunt, about the traditions and beliefs that shaped his world. She told him about Tennessee, about her parents, about the farm and the green hills and the rain that came soft and steady, unlike the violent storms of the plains. They built a shared language out of two broken ones, and in that language they found each other. Margaret did not forget Robert. She never forgot Robert. She carried him with her the way she carried the memory of her cabin and her garden and the blue dress he had given her the fabric for. But grief, she learned, is not a fixed thing. It changes shape over time. It does not shrink exactly, but it becomes something you can carry without it crushing you. It becomes part of you, instead of the thing that is destroying you. And alongside grief, she discovered, there was room for other things. For new love, for new purpose, for a life she never could have imagined. She also never stopped thinking about James, her son, a little boy in the root cellar. The question of whether he was alive or dead haunted her every day. It was the one wound that would not heal, the one thing she could not resolve or accept or make peace with. She talked to Takapai about it. She told him about the root cellar and the promise she had made and the child she had left behind. Takapai listened with the seriousness he brought to all things, and he told her he would try to find out what had happened. Months passed. Takapai sent word through the complex network of trade and communication that existed between Comanche bands and the few traders and intermediaries who moved between the native and settler worlds. It took time. Information on the frontier traveled slowly and unreliably. But eventually, word came back. A child had been found at the burned homestead by a neighbor. A boy, alive, taken in by a family in the settlement. James was alive. Margaret wept when she heard this. She wept in a way she had not allowed herself to weep since the day of the raid. Great shaking sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside her that they felt like they were tearing her apart and putting her back together at the same time. Takapai sat beside her and did not try to stop her crying. He understood that some pain needs to come out before a person can move forward. He put his hand on her back and he waited, and when she was done, he handed her water and said nothing, and that was exactly right. The question of James was not simple. Margaret wanted her son. She wanted him with a ferocity that had not dimmed in the months since she had been separated from him. But she also knew that going back to the settlement meant returning to a world that would see her as contaminated. A white woman who had lived among the Comanche, who had formed a bond with a Comanche man, who had become something that did not fit neatly into any category the settler world recognized. She would be an object of pity at best, and of suspicion and disgust at worst. And there was Sarah to consider. Sarah, who was happy here. Sarah, who had friends and a life and was thriving in a way that surprised and moved Margaret every day. Taking Sarah back to the settlement would mean tearing her away from a second home, inflicting a second trauma on a child who had already survived more than any child should have to. And there was Takapai, the man who had cut her ropes, the man who had shown her stars and shared his grief, and ridden alone into a grove of trees with empty hands to bring her back. The man she loved because she did love him. She had stopped denying it months ago. She loved him in a different way than she had loved Robert. Not more or less, just different. The way each fire burns with its own color and its own heat. Margaret spent weeks wrestling with this impossible equation. James on one side, everything else on the other. She lost sleep. She lost weight. She walked the edges of the camp at night, looking south toward the world she had come from, trying to find an answer in the darkness. The answer, when it came, was not what she expected. Takapai came to her one evening and sat beside her and said he would take her. He would take her and Sarah to the edge of the settlement. He would let her see James. He would give her the choice, stay or go. He would not hold her. He had never held her. He said, and the truth of that statement hit Margaret like a physical blow because she realized it was true. From the moment he cut those ropes, she had been free. She had stayed not because she was forced to, but because something in this place and this man had become her home. They made the journey in the early spring, when the grass was new and green, and the wildflowers were beginning to bloom. Takapai and Margaret and Sarah and a small group of warriors rode south over 3 days until they reached a ridge overlooking the river valley where the settlements lay. Margaret could see the cabins and the fields and the thin lines of smoke rising from chimneys. It looked exactly the same as it had when she left. It looked completely foreign. Takapai stayed on the ridge with the warriors. Margaret rode down alone with Sarah. She found the family that had taken James in, a couple named Henderson who had a farm near where Margaret's cabin had stood. When Margaret appeared at their door, the woman gasped and the man reached for his rifle. Margaret raised her hands and said her name, and said she was James's mother, and the Henderson woman began to cry. James was there. He was bigger than she remembered, and his hair was longer, and he looked at Margaret with Robert's eyes and did not recognize her. She knelt in front of him and said his name and said, "I am your mama," and the child looked at her with confusion, and then slowly, something shifted in his face, some deep recognition that went beyond memory, and he stepped forward and put his small arms around her neck, and Margaret held her son for the first time in nearly a year, and the world went blurry through her tears. She stayed with the Hendersons for 3 days. She held James and played with him and tried to fit herself back into the shape of the world she had left. But the shape was wrong. It did not fit anymore. She was not the woman who had left this place. She was someone new, someone forged in fire and loss and unexpected love, and the old world could not contain her. On the 3rd day, Margaret made her decision. She asked the Hendersons if they would continue to care for James. She told them she would come back. She would visit. She would make sure he knew who his mother was and that she loved him. But she could not stay here. Her life was somewhere else now. The Hendersons did not understand. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and horror, and Margaret accepted both because she knew that what she was doing looked incomprehensible from the outside. It only made sense from inside her own heart. She rode back up the ridge with Sarah. Takapai was waiting where she had left him, sitting on his horse with the patience of a man who had learned that some things cannot be rushed. He looked at her as she approached, and she saw the question in his eyes even though he did not ask it. She rode up beside him and stopped. The wind was blowing across the ridge, carrying the smell of grass and wildflowers and the distant smoke from the settlement below. Sarah was behind her on the horse, quiet and waiting. The warriors sat their horses in a loose line, watching. Margaret looked at Takapai and she said, in Comanche that was no longer halting but fluid and sure, "Let us go home." Takapai's face did not change. But something happened around his eyes, a softening, a release, as if a tension he had been carrying for a long time had finally let go. He nodded once, then he turned his horse and rode north, and Margaret rode beside him, and Sarah rode behind them, and the plains opened up ahead of them, vast and golden and endless. Margaret would return to the settlement many times over the years that followed. She would see James grow into a young man who looked like Robert and had Margaret's determination, and who never fully understood his mother's choices but loved her anyway. She would bridge 2 worlds in a way that few people in that era managed, moving between them with a grace that came not from comfort but from the understanding that she belonged fully to neither and partially to both. She and Takapai lived together for many years. They had children of their own, children who grew up speaking 2 languages and straddling 2 cultures and carrying in their blood the proof that walls between people are not as solid as they seem. Sarah grew into a remarkable young woman who could ride like a Comanche and read like a Texan, and who never forgot either of the worlds that had shaped her. Margaret never wore the blue dress again. It was gone, lost or destroyed in the raid, and she did not try to replace it. But sometimes, in the evenings, when the sun was going down and the sky turned that particular shade of blue that exists only on the Texas plains, she would stop whatever she was doing and stand still and look up. And she would remember, not with grief though grief was there, not with regret though regret was there too. She would remember with something that was larger than any single emotion, something that encompassed all of it, the pain and the love and the loss and the unexpected grace of a life that had gone nothing like she planned and had given her everything she needed. She had said, "Touch me, and I will kill you." She had meant it with every fiber of her being. And a man she had been taught to hate had looked at her rage and her fear and her strength and had seen something worth freeing. Not something to own, something to free. And in freeing her, he had freed himself, and together they had built something that neither of their worlds thought was possible. That is the truth of it, not a fairy tale, not a tragedy. Just a story about two human beings who found each other in the worst possible circumstances and chose, against every expectation and every rule and every voice that told them otherwise, to reach across the divide between them. They did not erase the divide. It was still there, real and painful and built on generations of violence and misunderstanding. But they stood on it together. They made their home on the bridge between two worlds. And from that impossible place, they looked out at a landscape that was brutal and beautiful and indifferent to their struggle. And they lived. They simply, stubbornly, magnificently lived. Some people say this kind of story could not happen. They say the hatred was too deep, the divide too wide, the times too violent. They say people do not change, and enemies do not love, and captives do not choose to stay. But those people are wrong, because the human heart is the most unpredictable force on earth. It does not follow maps or obey rules or respect the boundaries that history and culture and fear try to impose on it. It goes where it goes. And sometimes, against all odds and all logic, it goes toward the last person anyone would expect. And when it does, it creates something that no amount of hatred can destroy. This is what happened on the Texas plains in the 1800s. This is the story of Margaret and Takapai. And if it sounds impossible, that is because the best true stories always do.